Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be. Again, as always, hope you guys are having a great day. Today we're going to be talking about the post-Civil War era known as Reconstruction. Reconstruction is a very complicated and unique moment in U.S. history. I will say from the very beginning that I believe that Reconstruction, for the most part, was a failure in its own particular time. Much of what was attempting to be done during this period of Reconstruction was to try to not only knit the country back together, but it was also to establish a kind of new prototype, if you will, for what the meaning of freedom would mean in the United States. And much of what happens during Reconstruction is to establish legal precedents and to establish a environment where African Americans could gain socio-political and economic advantages that they had never had before. And for a very brief period of time during Reconstruction, for about 10 years or so, African Americans did experience the ability to vote. They did experience the elective franchise. That is, they were elected to a number of different high-ranking positions, including state assembly members and the Senate and mayors and governors and all of that. And so for a brief period of time, Reconstruction is a success. But eventually Reconstruction comes to an end, and it will do so in 1877 with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes to the presidency. And when Reconstruction comes to an end, really the racial environment in the South pretty much looks very much like it did before the Civil War. And that means that African Americans will effectively become slaves by another name. You can't call them slaves because of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, but African Americans in that region of the country will really be treated very much like slaves had been treated. Eric Foner, a fantastic historian, he wrote a book called Give Me Liberty, and he writes the following. He says, with the end of the Civil War, declared an Illinois congressman in 1865, the United States was a new nation for the first time, wholly free. The destruction of slavery, however, made the definition of freedom the central question on the nation's agenda. Right? We have to define what freedom actually is. It says, what is freedom? Asked James A. Garfield. Is it the bare privilege of not being chained? If this is all, then freedom is a bitter mockery, a cruel delusion. Did freedom mean simply the absence of slavery, or did it imply other rights for the former slaves? And if so, which ones? He asks, equal civil rights, the vote, property ownership. What exactly does all of this mean? It says, during Reconstruction, freedom became a terrain of conflict. Out of the conflict over the meaning of freedom arose new kinds of relations between black and white Southerners and a new definition of the rights of all Americans. Now, one of the things that I will say that Reconstruction does accomplish is it sets the groundwork for the contemporary civil rights movement. And when I say contemporary, I mean the civil rights movement that emerged during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s and 70s. And so in that regard, the Reconstruction period is important. And I wouldn't say it's not important, but it's a success in that regard. But it's going to take the United States about 100 years or so to come to terms with what the meaning of freedom actually was. And I will say this, that the civil rights movement, which happens 100 years later, which some people refer to as the Second Reconstruction, that Reconstruction, that civil rights movement did not necessarily always address some of the central issues that plagued African Americans, right? We can see that during the civil rights movement, there was a move towards desegregation, and there was a move towards having equal access to public spaces. But these laws, these desegregation moves, did not necessarily address poverty among African American communities. It didn't necessarily always address socioeconomic disparities. It didn't necessarily always address issues of police brutality and the fact that African Americans accounted for more folks in the prisons. So you can desegregate and you can pass laws that guarantee the protection of the law, but you can't necessarily uphold that if folks don't want to uphold that. And we can know that this is true because during the Reconstruction period, the 14th and 15th Amendments will be passed by the Congress, by a group known as Radical Republicans. And those laws were intended to help and give and grant African Americans the right to vote, the right to due process of law. And yet the reality is that black codes were instilled in the South, Jim Crow laws were instilled in the South, and those things basically undermined those constitutional amendments. And here's the point. You can pass all the laws you want, saying that we have to treat certain people equally, but if no one wants to enforce that, then it's not going to be enforced. And in the South, those laws were not enforced. This is a legacy, much like the Civil War itself, it is a legacy that is very much still with us to this very day. And so understanding Reconstruction is really important for understanding the development of race relations in the United States all the way up to the present time, but particularly it's very poignant to trying to understand and make sense of some of the movements that took place in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And of course, those events themselves had reverberations into the 21st century. So that's kind of an opening here. Reconstruction, if we had to get into its nuts and bolts, Reconstruction can really be broken down into three particular phases. You've got wartime Reconstruction, and wartime Reconstruction was a process that was developed by Abraham Lincoln. It started in 1863. During that year, there were some major victories for the Union Army: Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga. And what Lincoln begins to do in 1863 is he begins to devise a plan for reconstructing the Union. He comes up with a plan known as the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. And the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, at the center of it, basically had this idea that we would welcome the South back into the Union. Once 10% of the state's population said that they would be loyal to the Union, then we let everybody back in. And in many ways, what the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction does is it reflects Lincoln's desire to basically have no more violence, no more malice, no more evil doing. He basically doesn't necessarily want to forgive and forget, but he does want to extend the olive branch. And there are a lot of folks in the Republican Party who basically disagree with this premise. They think that Abraham Lincoln is being far too lenient with the South, and instead the Radical Republicans, they want to fundamentally change and punish the South. To many Radical Republicans, Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction sounds more like restoration of the Union and less like Reconstruction. And so basically the wartime Reconstruction plans, they don't really get off the ground because there's too much debate between the presidency and the Congress, and they can't get a lot done. One of the things they will get accomplished is the development of the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau was an organization, an institution established to try and address some of the issues and meet the needs that newly freed slaves would need, such as land distribution. Now, I will say this: one of the major failures of Reconstruction was that no significant plan for land redistribution was ever concocted. Newly freed slaves in the South never really received any property of their own that they could call their own. And the truth of the matter is that if they were going to be successful in American society, in a post-Civil War society, then they were going to have to be able to have access to land. Unfortunately, many of them didn't. And so what eventually happens is most or many African Americans become what we call sharecroppers, where basically they become tied to the land that they had already been working on, and they accumulate debt as they work on the land because it's not their land. They're not using their tools. They're not using their seed, what have you. And the idea is that you would grow enough crops throughout the year in order to liquidate your debt, and then maybe take a share of the crop at the end of it. Hence the name sharecropping. It was a deeply corrupt system that really placed African Americans into a state of peonage, if you will, almost serfdom, slave-like situation for them. But you've got this wartime Reconstruction, and of course, once the war is over, that sort of ends. Lincoln, of course, is assassinated. John Wilkes Booth kills him, and this will bring to the presidency Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson will usher in what becomes known as the second phase of Reconstruction, and that would be known as presidential Reconstruction. The reason why it's called presidential Reconstruction is because, for the most part, Andrew Johnson worked by himself to get the work done. And the reason for that, in part, is that when Andrew Johnson became president, when he succeeded to the presidency, the Congress went on recess. And so there was nobody in Congress around to basically stop Andrew Johnson from doing what he wanted to do. Now, Andrew Johnson is a Southern white man. He's about as racist as any of them can become. And although Johnson had spent a good portion of the war demonizing secessionists, Johnson was not really a fan of folks who were born into wealth. He himself had to pull himself up by his own bootstraps, if you will. He had to work for what he had. And so it would appear on the surface that Andrew Johnson was going to punish the South, but that's not what he does. Instead, he is very, very lenient. He allows the 10% plan that Lincoln forwarded to go through. He allows state constitutions to be rewritten. He allows for those state constitutions to effectively treat blacks the way the Southerners wanted to treat blacks. I mean, the only requirement that the South had to have under presidential Reconstruction was to abolish slavery. But you can abolish slavery and still place people into a state of slavery all at the same time. You do this by passing black codes, for example. Black codes would be laws which would forbid African Americans from sitting on juries. It would forbid African Americans from being able to carry guns. It would forbid African Americans from being able to marry white people. So although you do not necessarily have slavery as an institution legally in your country or legally in your state, you do have a system being constructed which places those folks into a state of slavery. Under Johnson's presidential Reconstruction, Southern states basically re-elected the same exact people to the Senate and to the House of Representatives who sat there beforehand. In fact, one of the individuals that is re-elected to the Congress was the former vice president of the Confederacy. And so when Congress comes back into session in December of 1866, I think it is, 65, 66, they're looking at all of these newly elected folks and they're saying, you know what, you've basically just restored the country to what it looked like before we even had a war. If we allow all these people back into the Congress, then we're basically gonna be no better off than we were before the war. This creates a lot of tension between Andrew Johnson and the Congress, particularly the radical Republicans, and the radical Republicans are growing in number. So acrid does the relationship between the president and the Congress get that eventually Andrew Johnson himself will be impeached. He's the first president ever to be impeached. He is impeached because he violates something known as the Tenure of Office Act, which was basically put into place to limit the presidential power to get rid of folks who were congressionally appointed. But at any rate, he's impeached. He's not thrown from office. One vote keeps him from being tossed out of office. But it does calm Johnson down. And ultimately, the radical Republicans will get to usher in the third phase of Reconstruction, which is radical Reconstruction. Sometimes it's referred to as Congressional Reconstruction. And under that, they will pass the 14th and the 15th Amendments to the Constitution. They will basically turn the South into a militarized zone, and they will send federal troops into the region in order to ensure that African Americans are treated fairly. And it's during that period of radical Reconstruction that African Americans really do, for the first time in perhaps all of U.S. history, get some semblance of equality. But by 1877, folks have basically had enough of Reconstruction. President Ulysses S. Grant, who had sat for 2 terms, he didn't really do a whole heck of a lot to deal with Reconstruction. A number of violent groups had emerged in the South, such as the Ku Klux Klan. In fact, they originated in 1866 in Pulaski, Tennessee. And this type of violence ultimately will force the federal government to pass something called the Ku Klux Klan Act in order to deal with the violence. But for the most part, Ulysses S. Grant isn't really concerned about dealing or addressing with issues attendant with African Americans in the South and ensuring their equality. So by 1877, the Republican Party decides that they've had enough and they will end Reconstruction. It's an interesting period in our history, and this mini lecture here doesn't really do it justice. It's really just the basic, very, very, very basic nuts and bolts of it. There's so much more to be said. So really dive into your reading this week, because this topic is monumental and it is important because, like I said before, it sets the stage for the contemporary civil rights movement. And as far as I'm concerned, I believe we're still dealing and addressing with issues of racial disparity and these sorts of topics. And in order to understand how to best deal with them, we need to really look at history, understand what it can teach us, because as we know, history is a roadmap. William Faulkner, the famed novelist, once said, history isn't dead. It isn't even past yet. It's very much alive and well. It is a roadmap for where we are to go. And hopefully you will be able to utilize the information from this week and from all of this class to better understand your own society. That's what we got going on this week, guys. So if you have any questions, again, let me know. Otherwise, as always, go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you. Live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a blessed week, guys.